It's a quiet Saturday morning in Colorado Springs. The Friday nightlife is dying down. On the north side of town, pub owner Sonia Riley is wrapping up her day at the Grandview Lounge.
I'd worked that day all day. I was, having a few glasses of wine right along with everybody else. And most of them had left around 10:30 or so.
Okay guys, I am out of here for the night. Can I have my purse please, sweetie? You have a good night.
You
Lock
too.
up, okay?
I
Be
will.
careful going home.
With only a handful of patrons left, Sonia heads home to get some sleep. Just minutes after dozing off, Sonia wakes up to alarming news.
What happened?
I don't know. Please call these.
The next thing I knew, my husband was coming upstairs and he said to me that he just drove him by the bar and that it was on fire.
Sonia races back to the Grandview, but she can hardly recognize the place.
We don't know yet. We don't know.
There were fire trucks everywhere. There were police cars everywhere. It just had this tremendous amount of heat. It was totally destroyed.
The horror is just beginning. Moments after firefighters enter the blaze, they reappear holding a man's limp body.
They brought out an individual and laid them just into the parking lot.
EMTs race to the victim's aid, but he is already deceased. And it wasn't the fire that killed him.
This individual had been shot in the head.
Police radio dispatch for reinforcements and advise they're now standing at the scene of a possible homicide.
We have set up a perimeter. Now we're protecting our crime scene.
Across town, Lt.Joe Kenda gets an urgent call.
I have a dispatcher who says that the fire department is on the scene of a building fire, Vickers and Union, and they have discovered a body that has gunshot wounds. Okay, we're on our way.
Minutes later, Kenda arrives on the scene. He finds the Grandview Lounge still smoldering and surrounded by chaos.
You get to a scene like that, and it's something I've never seen before, and I've seen many things. The press is arriving, the cops, everybody's zipping around. The guys in the fire department are overwhelmed by the circumstances. Everybody's an emotional wreck at that point. And my thought then was, oh my.
Even more alarming, the body count has risen. Lying on the sidewalk, Kenda spots not one, but 3 covered corpses.
They see they all have multiple gunshot wounds to the head. The fire damage is post-mortem in nature. There's no question these people were dead before that fire began.
The violence is more extreme than any bar shooting Kenda's ever seen, and the number of shots fired suggest multiple shooters.
Is this a revenge killing? Is it an ex-husband and friend who come in here to specifically kill one of the females and wind up killing everyone else? Is this a terrorist raid? Is this a gangland execution? What is going on here? When you arrive at a scene like that, everything is a possibility.
Kenda needs to find out why this establishment was targeted.
I don't know what the Grandview Lounge is, or what kind of place it is, or who frequents that place. Are they involved in some low-level criminal activity? I want to learn, and I want to learn carefully.
While firefighters finish hosing down the bar, Kenda questions its owner, Sonia Riley.
Sonia? I'm Lt.Joe Kenda. I definitely need to ask you a few questions.
By Sonia's account, the Grandview Lounge hardly sounds like a criminal hotspot.
It was kind of like Cheers. And everybody knew everybody. And people had their own little seats, and it was just a typical neighborhood bar.
Kenda receives word that all 3 victims have been identified. They are Deborah Green, James Rupke, and Joanne McNamara. Sonia instantly recognizes the names.
Deborah Green was my bartender. She had 2 small children, and she'd worked for me for about a month then. I was very impressed with her. I liked her very much.
When Kenda asks her about Joanne McNamara, Sonia breaks down in tears.
Joanne McNamara was my best friend at the time. We were just like sisters almost. All of a sudden, your whole world is turned upside down. It's changed in a matter of seconds.
James Repke was Joanna's new boyfriend. She had introduced the 52-year-old salesman to Sonia earlier that evening.
He was a very gentlemanly gentleman. He was, someone I'd expect Joanne to be with. I liked him.
Kenda presses Sonia for potential suspects. Anyone who might have reason to harm James, Joanne, or Deborah. But Sonia claims that all three were good-natured, law-abiding citizens.
There's no indication in any of the victim backgrounds that they're doing anything other than spending a little time in the neighborhood bar.
It makes no sense. There's no rhyme or reason to it.
Detectives interrupt with urgent news. They've located a fourth victim nearly half a mile west of the crime scene. He suffered the same assault as the other three, but he survived.
We have one individual who had been shot in the head who was able to run from that location.
When I discovered we had a man alive who had been present during at least part of the commission of this crime, I was elated. Well, at least we've got somebody we can talk to.
The survivor's name is Robert Kuritic, but the gunshot wound to his head has left him unable to recall the assault.
That's why this work can be so frustrating. You've got an eyewitness, and he turns out to not be helpful, not because he doesn't want to be, but he can't be.
With no viable witnesses and no solid leads, Kenda turns to the crime scene, hoping physical evidence will shed some light on the situation. But the fire has left him little to work with.
A great deal of the evidence has been hopelessly damaged. Not all of it. When I walked in, I saw 15 or 20 expended casings on the floor. A large number of gunshots.
All .22 caliber, and all fired from semi-automatic pistols.
He has spare ammunition. He is prepared to kill when he arrives.
What Kenda doesn't know is why.
Are they looking for a specific target and kill other witnesses? Is everyone a target? All those possibilities exist.
The killer's motive might still be a mystery, but Kenda is already piecing together an idea of how the attack unfolded.
His intent is clear, and he is prepared to accomplish that before he ever walks through the door of that bar. But he certainly didn't make a demand. He just started killing people. Repke, who had 3 gunshot wounds to the head, he was dead before he hit the floor. Mr. Kuritic has a multiply fractured skull, so the bullet doesn't penetrate his skull. The shooter, I'm convinced, believed he killed him.
Joanne McNamara and Deborah Green both sustained scattered shots to the body, which suggests they were wounded while running for their lives. It doesn't take Kenda long to figure out where they went.
I went back to the ladies' room. I looked at the door and it had been kicked in. Somebody was trying to hold that door closed in that ladies' room and bleeding on the floor.
Oh my God, let's go here. Let's go here. Oh my God. What is he doing? What does he want?
The bloodstains paint a chilling picture of what happened next.
The only place to go was the ladies' room. They went there in hopes of being safe. And he forced his way in and killed them both.
Can't imagine what it would be like to be in a bathroom or hugging a toilet and having somebody with an automatic weapon shooting at you. They must have been so terribly frightened.
Kenda believes that at this point, Robert Kuritic woke up and staggered out the front door unnoticed. Arson investigators lead Kenda to the killer's final stop, before he made his escape.
Fire started right here.
The arson investigator said, there we go. That's where your fire started.
Looks like they tried at least 4 different times to set this place on fire, and it goes this way and goes up toward the bar.
There are 3 bottles of liquor and a container of lighter fluid that have been emptied. It's a concealment fire. Someone has committed a murder and has burned a building in order to cover it up.
Unfortunately, the inferno has served its purpose.
You're standing in this burned out bar, surrounded by the knowledge that 3 people are dead. And you've got zilch. Why is he doing this? Could he do this again? He's going to do this again.
Little does Kenda realize, less than 20 yards away, his fears have already come to pass.
When I discovered the identity of the 2 girls, and I just felt awful, I feel a sense of rage, and it's cold rage. I don't know who you are, but I'm going to find out, and you are going to have to stand up for this.
On Fire 6, odor investigation.
In the early hours of May 17th, authorities in Colorado Springs discover 3 ordinary citizens gunned down in a burning bar. Deborah Green, James Repke, and Joanne McNamara. Lt.Joe Kenda is desperate to make an arrest. But after analyzing the charred crime scene, he's at a loss for ideas on where to start.
The fire has done its job. It's obscured a great amount of evidence. We are stumped at this point.
But just around the corner, events are unfolding that will make Kenda's next move painfully clear. While securing the area surrounding the bar, Officer Howard Black approaches the Quickway, a 24-hour convenience store several doors down from the fire. There isn't a soul in sight.
As I'm walking up on the convenience store, I notice that one of the glass doors, of the double doors, was actually totally broken out. The gas pumps were still on. I could hear them clicking. I'm seeing no one inside. I was really concerned on what we might find on the inside of this convenience store.
On stepping through the door, Black's concern quickly turns to horror.
I could see over the counter that we had 2 young females who both appeared to have gunshot wounds.
We've got 2 locations, 1 on fire. We've got 5 people dead. You know, this has gone from a killing to a massacre.
Officers identify the victims as 22-year-old Sandra Howard and her teenage sister, Elaine Sindeltecker.
I always thought of Elaine as my best friend. Sandy would do anything for anybody. She was always there for all of us. We were a very close family.
Sandra had recently begun working the graveyard shift at the Quickway to help support her 3 sons.
She only worked there for a few days. They had just started opening up 24 hours, and she wasn't happy about having to work the late night shift.
The second victim, Elaine, was just visiting her big sister that night.
She went over there to keep Sandy company, so she wasn't alone. It was probably hard to stay up all night long.
They were just down to earth, just regular people, just American girls, just plain old kids.
When I learned more about what was going on, I just felt awful. He didn't lose 1 daughter, he lost them both. In an instant, over basically nothing. It's almost overwhelming. What are the odds?
Surveying the scene, Kenda notes the probable murder weapon and cold-blooded M.O. Both bear striking resemblance to the carnage at the Grandview Lounge.
They've been shot execution style in the back of the head, 3 times each. There's expended casings on the counter, expended casings on the floor, the same as we discovered in the bar.
But the question remains, what was the killer's motive? Lying behind the counter, Kenda spots a possible answer.
There are 2 registers. They are both open, and the currency is gone.
Could all this bloodshed be the result of an armed robbery? Kenda orders detectives at the Grandview Lounge to check the cash register. They quickly confirm Joe's hunch.
The paper money is missing out of both places.
This was probably a robbery gone bad.
Kenda has his team dig through the city's criminal database in search of probable suspects. But the crime doesn't fit the MO of a typical armed robber.
This is still not a normal armed robbery. Armed robbery usually turns to gunfire when the money isn't handed over. It doesn't go the other way, where somebody comes in and just starts blasting. I'm looking at this scene, even though the front door was locked, one side of the glass was completely gone.
Kenda starts to piece together how the crime unfolded.
He does the Grandview Lounge first, he doesn't get enough money, and he immediately goes to the next place available.
But when the killer tried the doors, they were locked.
I think he shoots the door up. And steps under the push bar. And now he's inside.
Kenda believes Sandra and Elaine offered their full cooperation and handed over the money in the registers.
Just give it to him.
But it wasn't enough to save their lives.
He made them kneel down. I'm sure they thought they might survive it. They never knew they weren't going to. Their death was instantaneous. Some comfort in the fact to their family. No one suffered.
It was so hard to even describe how hard it was to lose not one, but 2 sisters in one day. And I can't imagine what my parents went through to lose 2 daughters in one day.
I've never cried so much in my life. My daughters are just trying to make a living. You know, they didn't deserve that. Not by a long shot.
On checking register tapes from the 2 businesses, detectives calculate the killer made off with a total of $233. Just $46 per human life.
You're gonna kill for $233? Why is he doing this? I have no idea. Could he do this again? He's going to do this again.
As detectives fan out across the surrounding area, Kenda hangs back. The empty cash register has given him an idea.
What if we have robbery cameras in here?
Kenda recalls that the police department had recently installed dozens of hidden cameras in stores across the city, all designed to catch robberies in the act.
They are concealed within something that looks normal. They are designed that way so that you don't notice them if you're standing there. They're wireless. We have a bait bill in the register. If somebody pulls that bill, the camera goes off and takes one picture every 3 seconds.
But Kenda knows his chances of finding one here are slim.
I had no idea whether there was one in there or not, but I certainly wanted to find out. I call one of my detectives, Bill Schinkel, who's a robbery detective, whose job it is to install and maintain these cameras.
Bill, it's Kenda. Wake up.
I was kind of startled by the phone call. Joe Kenda was telling me, hey, we have multiple people shot up here.
And I said, Billy, you got to pay attention to me. Do you have cameras in the Quickway at Vickers and Union? Yeah, I do.
Bill explains that the cameras in the Quickway are hidden in a hollow black box made to look like a stereo speaker.
It had a Velcro cover, and you pull off the cover, and inside of it was housed a motor-driven 35mm camera.
Great. Maybe they show us something. Come down here.
Even if the camera was tripped, there's no guarantee it captured a usable image.
I was praying and hoping that somebody hadn't accidentally set that camera off before this perpetrator came in and committed his crime.
My only thought at that moment was, oh, please, show me a picture of Mr. X. Give me one picture of this son of a bitch.
Daybreak, May 17, 1986. In the race to track down an armed robber turned mass murderer, Detective Joe Kenda and his team are still stuck at square one, identifying the suspect.
Anytime there's a murder, the perpetrator has a head start. It may be 20 minutes. It might be 5 days. We have to catch up. And it's a marathon. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Mr. X needs a name and a location and an arrest. Because what if he decides he likes this? And he's gonna do it again tonight.
In an effort to put a face to this cold-blooded killer, Joe Kenda is pinning his hopes on a pair of surveillance cameras hidden at the Quickway store. But the cameras are only triggered when a bait bill is removed from the store register, which means they aren't always reliable.
There's always a concern when you have a surveillance camera. Are they going to be of any use? I mean, did it go off? Could they have been tripped before the robbery by somebody else?
Kenda puts those questions to Bill Schinkel, the robbery detective in charge of installing the surveillance cameras.
Evening. We got 5 dead bodies and a killer on the loose. Where's the cameras?
All right, hopefully we got something good on you.
I showed him where both of the cameras were located and mentioned to him that both indicator lights were showing red, which meant that the cameras had been activated.
He says, we got pictures. And I said, are they any good? We have no way of knowing. They can't be reviewed until the film is developed. Develop them and bring them back to me.
1 hour later, Schinkel meets Kenda back at the station, photos in hand. Thumbing through the snapshots, it's hard to say whether the cameras captured a crime in progress or business as usual.
A lot of them weren't useful. They were pictures of elbows and what have you, not recognizable pictures, but some were.
Near the bottom of the stack, Kenda and Schinkel pause on a shot of a man dressed in a windbreaker.
Nothing real distinguishable, darker skinned male, and no one you'd even give a second look to, you know, in the course of a day if somebody walked by you. So there was nothing real discernible about him.
But it's not the man's general appearance that catches their eye. It's what he's holding in his right hand. A Ruger Mark I 22 caliber pistol. The same caliber weapon used in all 5 murders.
He's our guy. We have no idea who he is, but you can see enough of his face to where if you know him, you recognize him.
It's a key piece of evidence, one that dispels any doubt the murders were carried out by a single shooter.
It's just one guy. One busy guy.
But first, Kenda needs to pin a name to the killer's face. Kenda calls in a number of patrons of the Grandview Lounge, but none recognize the man in the photograph. Kenda sits down to speak with Kay Hazlett, a cocktail waitress at the Grandview, who got off work just prior to the shooting.
Really appreciate your cooperation in this. I know it's been very difficult. I want to show you something. I have a photograph. I want to tell me if you recognize the individual that's in it.
A look of recognition immediately crosses her face.
Tell me where you recognize that from.
He was at the bar last night. I mean, I even remember the jacket.
Are you 100% sure that that is the individual that was in the bar?
Yes, I am.
He came in, he walked clear to the end of the bar. He didn't really talk to anybody. He ordered a drink. And he just, he just wasn't comfortable. He just was nervous, and he was still in the bar when we left.
Kay recalls an unusual mannerism that was hard to ignore.
He had a funny twitch, he had a quiver, and he was just nervous, antsy, I don't know. It was just made me uncomfortable.
Kay's account paints a chilling picture of the killer's intentions.
He's getting a lay of the land. He's looking this place over, gathering information, sitting at the end of the bar, not talking to anybody, not bothering anybody, just watching. No one's going to live through this. And he is prepared to accomplish that before he ever walks through the door of that bar. He fires a number of shots in this place. He walks right around the corner to the Quickway store and kills in the same way he killed in the Grandview. He's not angry. angry. He's not afraid. How dangerous is he? As dangerous as they come.
But who is Mr. X? And more importantly, where is he now? Some detectives think the killer climbed into a car and fled town. But Kenda poses another possibility.
It's my theory this guy's local. Seems to me like he's on foot.
It is relatively common for armed robbers to live where they rob. They walk, they don't drive. It limits their exposure when they're running after the crime. They're home counting the money before the first officer arrives on the scene.
Did Mr. X kill 5 innocent people and set fire to a building in his own backyard? For Kenda, there's only one way to find out.
We get an aerial photograph of that area. We draw a circle 1 mile in diameter from the crime scene. We want to know who lives in every address in that circle.
And what I want to do is I want to flyer that entire area, every type of establishment you can think of, bars, restaurants, supermarkets.
But there's a problem. Even working around the clock, it would take Kenda's handful of homicide detectives weeks to interview the several thousand citizens living inside the search radius.
This was large scale. This was something we hadn't done before in any of my time with the police department. I'm not sure the police department's ever done anything in that large scale.
This time we needed everyone with a badge, anybody we could get that would be willing to help.
Fortunately, every cop, deputy, and DA official in town is already well aware of the massacre.
Obviously, there was a great desire to get this person arrested, whether it be over the fact that he could do this again or just as heinous this crime was in the first place. We wanted this guy caught.
I had cops on their days off, on holiday, on vacation, coming into my office, give me something to do.
After dividing the search party into teams, Kenda hands each member a photo of Mr. X, along with a checklist of addresses and strict marching orders.
We're gonna knock on every door, we're gonna talk to every person, and go back until we find them, and I don't care how long it takes, we're gonna get this done.
We'd start canvassing in a very methodical way this entire neighborhood to try to find anybody who might identify or know the individual we had a picture of.
We were hoping that somebody may recognize him and give us a lead to who he might be.
But after 6 straight hours of searching door to door, the canvassing effort is losing steam. Investigators have questioned more than 1,000 residents, but none have brought them any closer to Mr. X.
This could have all been wasted time. We may not have gotten anything out of this.
Even Kenda is starting to wonder if the massive search was all for nothing.
Sometimes it doesn't work out at all. What you think is a sterling idea turns out to bomb.
But just when it seems the canvassing effort is going nowhere, DA investigator Larry Martin has a sterling idea of his own. One that leads him to a nearby pizza place.
So I thought, well, you know, they're out in the neighborhood all the time. They may know something. They may recognize somebody from these photographs. So I decided to give it a shot and stop in there and see what I could come up with.
I haven't seen that guy in here or anywhere around. Haven't seen him.
So I contacted several employees. None of those recognized the man in the photographs.
It seems Larry Martin has hit another dead end when a delivery man stops in for a pickup and makes a startling remark about the photo in his hand.
Take a look at the picture, see if you can recognize this guy. Seen him around anywhere?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I delivered pizza to this guy.
Really?
He said, I know that guy. I've delivered pizzas to him before. As a matter of fact, he lives right down the street from the pizza company.
I was exhilarated. We're no longer just punching in the dark. We're in the chase, and I loved it.
It's been 15 hours since police responded to a routine fire and instead found the scene of a bloody massacre.
You have no idea who this person was that committed this heinous act.
To resolve this was not only necessary for the victims, it was necessary for the psyche of this entire city.
Unknown to the public, Joe Kenda has a surveillance photo of Mr. X and a long-shot hunch that he lives within walking distance of the crime scene. An exhaustive canvassing effort may have just proven that hunch.
Luckily, that turned out to be a good move because one of the pizza guys, delivery guys, did recognize the man in the photograph.
The face in the photo isn't all the delivery man knows.
He said, I don't remember his name, but I remember he's got a funny last name. Matter of fact, he lives in the Berkshire Apartments, which is right down the street from the pizza company.
The apartment complex is only a few hundred yards from the search perimeter. As Larry Martin zeroes in on the address, the canvassing effort turns up another lead.
Can I help you?
Yes, good afternoon, man. We're in the area here.
And she says, well, we don't know. I've never seen him around. But I have a friend here. Can she look at the picture?
Hey, come here a minute.
Moments later, another woman appears at the door.
I know this man.
The friend looked at the photographs and said, that looks like a guy that I went to plumbing school with.
And though the two fell out of touch some years ago, she remembers his name as clearly as his face.
I know it's Gilbert. Archibald.
His name is Gilbert Archibald. How sure are you that's him? 10 on a scale of 10, that's him.
Police search utility records for an address to go with the name. In doing so, they quickly turn up a familiar location.
The record indicated a current address for him at the Berkshire Apartments in Colorado Springs.
Okay, Mr. X, now you have a name. And it's Gilbert Eugenio Archibald. Now we're in the chase. We're no longer just punching in the dark.
To see what he's up against, Kenda has his detectives pull the record of Archibald's prior offenses. But it's a surprisingly short list.
You expect him to have a long, progressive criminal record, but this guy had none of that. How does a guy go from 0 to 1,000 miles an hour in criminal activity?
A longtime resident of Colorado Springs, the 29-year-old plumber hails from a solid middle-class family. Friends and colleagues describe Gilbert as a hard worker and an all-around good guy. He was even a lifelong member of the Boy Scouts, where he'd risen to the rank of Eagle, a detail that seems especially out of character.
That shows you have a concern for your fellow man. How do you go from that to executing people and setting the place on fire?
With Archibald's name and address in hand, detectives start planning his arrest.
We knew we were dealing with a very dangerous person. There was a good chance that when the arrest was attempted, it could erupt in gunfire. We felt it was best because of the type of person we were dealing with to have a SWAT team on scene to try to effect that arrest.
They were trained for that very purpose, and they will, by force if necessary, gain entry and make an arrest.
Under cover of darkness, SWAT team members arrive at Archibald's apartment complex. In the manager's office across the parking lot, Kenda meets with the surveillance team for debriefing.
We've had him under surveillance all afternoon. His car's in the parking lot. We have reason to believe he's in the apartment.
Joe gives SWAT members their first objective: clear everyone but Archibald from the building, quietly.
We need to get all of his neighbors safely out of the building. Our concern is, if there is a gun battle, drywall doesn't stop bullets.
They came out in their bathrobes and pajamas, and we had to take them out as they were to protect them.
By 2 a.m., police believe the only resident left inside is Archibald. SWAT specialists take position in the hallway and await further instruction.
We had SWAT members in the hallway outside his front door and around the windows outside his back windows. So we had the apartment contained.
At that point, we have a discussion. What do we think we can do next?
Kenda hands Archibald's number to a police negotiator.
We can all hear what's being said, both sides of the conversation, and the call is placed.
Seconds later, a voice answers the line, but it's not the one police were expecting.
Hello?
When the phone was answered, to our surprise, it was answered by a female.
We're like, uh-oh, who's that? We don't know. But we say, is Gil there? Just a minute, is the reply.
It's a horrifying development, one that changes everything.
Now he's got a hostage. If he wants to use one, he's got one.
"24 hours into the investigation of 5 brutal homicides, police and SWAT team members have surrounded the home of their prime suspect, former Eagle Scout and wanted mass murderer Gilbert Archibek. Fearing his arrest could end in a shootout, police have evacuated everyone from Archibek's building. But they quickly realize their killer isn't the only one still inside.
Is Gil there?
Hold on a second.
Once we made the phone call and the female answered the phone, it threw a big wrench into the works. We had no idea anybody else was in there. Now we have to decide, is it safe to forcefully enter to try to take Mr. Archibek in custody, or now does he have a hostage that we have to worry about?
But it's too late to pull out now. So when a male voice picks up the phone, Joe Kenda gives the nod to proceed as planned.
Hello?
Gil, is that you? Yeah, we're the police. And we have a warrant charging you with 5 counts of first-degree murder, Gilbert, among other things. We don't want to hurt you, and we don't want to hurt that girl. But you need to come out of that apartment, and you need to do it now. He says okay.
It seems Archibek is going quietly after all. But moments after he sets the phone down, a commotion erupts on the line.
You hear him talking to the girl, and you hear her screaming, "The police? Why are the police outside? My God, what have you done?" He finally gets back on the phone, and you can hear him breathing. "You heard what we said?" "Yeah." "What are you gonna do?"
Police don't need a phone to hear Archibek's answer.
SWAT team, execute, execute.
Immediately we heard gunfire inside the apartment. We heard the girl screaming, and we thought that perhaps she had been shot. The word was immediately given to the SWAT team to enter that apartment.
We say, hit the apartment, hit it. So they blow up the doorway and the party begins.
On gaining entry, SWAT operatives follow the screams to the master bedroom. There they find the frantic woman, alone and apparently unharmed.
She's standing with her hands in the air. She's wearing a pair of panties only. She's screaming at the top of her lungs.
It's your hands! Get down on the ground!
It doesn't take long to figure out why.
They find Gilbert in the bathroom. The top of his head's in the bathtub.
He had shot himself in the head with the pistol that he had been carrying.
Kenda heads straight to the scene for a first-hand look at the suspect. He'll never get to question Archibek about his heinous crimes, but the suicide is all the confession Kenda needs.
This guy killed 5 innocent people for nothing. And I looked at him and I thought, well, good for you, Gilbert. You saved the taxpayers a lot of money.
On searching his apartment, detectives uncover a wealth of hard evidence tying Gilbert to the cold-blooded crime spree.
I found the jacket he was wearing in the photograph, the murder weapon, $200 and some in cash. So everything is there. He's our guy.
But there's still one detail Kenda can't seem to square away. The Eagle Scout's motive for murder.
It still doesn't make any sense to me. This behavior is so evil and so far from what the Eagle Scouts stand for. It's just hard to imagine.
We would never know his side of the story, why he did this, why he would take the lives of 5 innocent people for no reason. And you're frustrated when something like that happens.
Kenda decides to question Jill Capes, the woman found screaming in Archibek's bedroom. Kenda wonders if Archibek's female companion could provide him with some answers.
We talked to her at some length after we calmed her down. She's an on-again, off-again girlfriend of Gilbert.
But when asked why the upstanding Eagle Scout would murder 5 innocent people, Archibek's girlfriend can't think of a single reason. Except maybe one.
I knew about the coke.
She says he's used cocaine off and on for a couple of years.
Jill claims that over the past year, Gilbert's recreational cocaine habit had devolved into a full-blown addiction. It's the red flag Kenda's been looking for.
What we learn about Gilbert Archibek is, at a minimum, has a financial issue, and at a maximum, he has a behavior issue. All because of his interest and use of narcotics. Is that part of his motivation? I'm sure it was.
Archibek had a minor police record for traffic offenses. Not much to tell us why, this weekend, he became the cold-blooded killer of 5 people.
Many blame Archibek's drug addiction for his fall from grace, but to this day, most people still believe the massacre was fueled by something far more sinister. Something hidden inside the Eagle Scout all along. Something that will haunt the city for decades to come.
It was a sad day in Colorado Springs history that 5 people were murdered in a matter of about 20 minutes. It's something I'll never forget.
Things aren't the same anymore. You realize in an instant you can lose anybody at any time.
How do we get from Eagle Scout to drug-addicted mass murderer? The only one that knows.
The night Florida forgot how to sleep began with a silence that felt wrong, the kind of quiet that presses against the ears and makes even the ocean hold its breath. A night when a porch light burned until dawn for no reason and a front door stood half open as if someone had stepped outside for a second and never came back. A night that would be reduced to 4 words in the morning papers: missing, unexplained, cold case. But before the headlines, before the sirens, before the questions, there was only a house at the edge of a palm-lined street and the sense that something had slipped out of the world without asking permission. Florida, summer of 2000, heat clinging to skin like a second life, air thick with insects and salt, a place where people trusted routine, trusted the sun to rise and neighbors to wave, trusted that bad things happened somewhere else, not here, not on this block, not to this family. The house sat low and pale beneath the streetlights, windows dark, the television still on, its blue glow flickering across empty furniture, a local news anchor frozen mid-sentence, words spilling into a room with no one left to hear them. On the kitchen counter, a glass of water half full, ice melted into nothing, condensation rings marking time like a clock that had stopped counting. A purse lay on a chair, keys inside, wallet untouched. Shoes by the door, neatly placed, as if their owner planned to return in minutes. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, nothing that screamed violence, and that was the first shock, because whatever had happened here had happened quietly, cleanly, leaving behind only absence, the most unsettling evidence of all. By sunrise, the street was alive with flashing lights and murmurs, squad cars parked at odd angles, tape snapping softly in the breeze, neighbors standing barefoot on lawns, arms folded, eyes fixed on the house as if it might suddenly explain itself. Officers moved in and out, radios crackling, notebooks filling with details that felt too ordinary to matter and too strange to ignore. The victim, because that word arrived quickly, even before anyone knew where they were, had been last seen the evening before, according to friends, according to a cashier at a nearby store, according to a routine that had never been broken until now. They had plans. They had reasons to be home. They had no history of disappearing, no note, no warning, no trail leading away from the front door. The first headlines hit by noon. Florida resident vanishes without trace. Quiet neighborhood rocked by mysterious disappearance. Cold case wasn't written yet, but it hovered in the margins, waiting. Detectives worked the scene again and again, retracing steps, photographing angles, lifting prints that belonged to the living and meant nothing on their own. They catalogued everything left behind, every object that suggested a life interrupted rather than ended. Friends were questioned, voices trembling as they repeated the same sentences, the same memories, searching their own words for something they might have missed. Family members arrived, faces tight with disbelief, insisting this wasn't possible, that this person would never just leave, not like this, not without calling, not without saying goodbye. Outside the house, the Florida sun rose higher, burning off the morning haze, exposing the scene to daylight scrutiny, and still nothing made sense. No witnesses reported screams. No neighbors heard doors slam. The street had slept through the moment someone vanished from it, and that realization sank in like a weight. Investigators widened the net, canvassing the area, knocking on doors, asking about unfamiliar cars, strange noises, anything out of place. People offered fragments, someone walking a dog late, a car idling briefly, a shadow moving where it shouldn't, but none of it connected, none of it formed a picture clear enough to act on. As hours stretched into days, the absence grew louder. The house was locked, sealed, left as it was found, a snapshot of an interrupted life. Flyers went up on telephone poles and store windows, a face smiling back at passers-by, eyes unaware of what was coming. Phone lines were opened, tips encouraged, hope carefully maintained. Helicopters buzzed overhead, search teams combed nearby woods, canals, empty lots, the Florida landscape offering too many places for secrets to hide. Each search ended the same way, with tired volunteers returning empty-handed, the sun dropping low, shadows lengthening, the same question echoing unanswered. Detectives followed leads that flared brightly and died just as fast. A reported sighting miles away turned out to be someone else. A supposed argument the night before unraveled under scrutiny. A rumor of debt, of jealousy, of a hidden life collapsed when records were checked and nothing matched the narrative. The victim's past was laid bare, examined inch by inch, looking for cracks where something might have slipped through, but all they found was normalcy, routines, relationships that didn't end in threats or violence. It was as if the case refused to give them even the courtesy of a motive. Weeks passed. The media interest surged, then wavered, then surged again as the mystery deepened. Bizarre disappearance baffles police. No suspects, no answers. Cold case crept closer, whispered in newsrooms, hinted at in late-night broadcasts. Investigators felt the pressure, the unspoken deadline imposed by public attention and the knowledge that time was the enemy, that every day without answers allowed evidence to fade, memories to blur, trails to go cold. They revisited the house, re-examined the items left behind, searching for meaning in placement, in what was missing as much as in what remained. One detail began to gnaw at them, small but persistent, a choice that didn't fit the pattern of an ordinary night. Why leave with nothing? Why step out without keys, without money, without shoes suitable for going far? It suggested urgency, or trust, or coercion so subtle it left no mark. The door itself offered no answers, no splintered frame, no damaged lock, only the quiet implication that whoever left did so willingly, at least for the first step. That idea unsettled everyone who touched the case, because it pointed toward someone known, someone familiar, someone who could stand at that threshold without raising alarm. The community felt it too. Conversations shifted. Neighbors eyed each other differently, replaying memories, reinterpreting casual exchanges, wondering if they had missed signs, if danger had been closer than they believed. The house became a landmark of unease, people slowing as they passed, glancing toward the windows, half expecting movement inside. At night, lights on the street seemed brighter, doors locked more carefully, routines tightened in small, defensive ways. The disappearance had punctured the illusion of safety, leaving behind a question mark that hung over everything. Months later, when searches dwindled and the flyers curled and faded, the case entered a new phase, quieter, more methodical, more desperate. Files grew thicker. Timelines were refined, narrowed, expanded again. Phone records were analyzed, financial accounts traced, movements reconstructed from scraps of data. Still, there was no body, no crime scene, no definitive proof of foul play, only the certainty that someone was gone and the conviction that they hadn't chosen to vanish. The law demanded evidence, and the evidence refused to appear. The phrase Florida 2000 cold case closed would one day be printed with confidence, but in these early days, closure was a foreign concept, an idea that felt almost insulting in its optimism. There was only the open wound of not knowing, the lingering image of a door ajar in the night, the sense that the truth was nearby and impossibly distant at the same time. Investigators kept working, driven by instinct as much as protocol, haunted by the simplicity of the scene and the complexity of its implications. Somewhere between those two extremes, they believed, the answer waited, silent, patient, watching as the years began to pile up, each one adding weight to a mystery that refused to settle, refused to fade, refused to let Florida forget the night it lost someone without a sound. By the second week, the investigation had learned how to breathe in shorter, sharper bursts, every move calculated, every lead treated like it might be the last one worth chasing, and inside the police department the case stopped feeling new and started feeling heavy, the kind of file that bends a desk drawer and follows detectives home at night. The initial shock had settled into something colder, something more methodical, and that was when the questions grew teeth. The timeline was rebuilt minute by minute, not because anyone believed the answer would reveal itself so easily, but because routine was all they had left to interrogate. The victim's final day was laid out like a map with missing roads, a normal morning, a few errands, casual conversations that now sounded scripted in hindsight, a return home just before sunset, and then nothing, a black gap where life should have continued. Investigators replayed that evening obsessively, imagining the house as it had been, the way the air must have felt heavy and unmoving, the way the television murmured in the background, the way a knock at the door might not have raised suspicion if the person on the other side was familiar. They tested the locks, measured the distance from the porch to the street, noted how quickly someone could step out of sight under the cover of palms and parked cars. There were no defensive wounds because there was no body, no blood because there was no scene, no shattered glass because whatever happened did not announce itself. It was a crime that seemed to understand restraint. Witness interviews intensified, not with the frantic energy of the first days, but with a colder persistence. Friends were brought back in, asked to repeat themselves, their stories examined for inconsistencies not because detectives believed they were lying, but because time has a way of sharpening truth and dulling memory. Co-workers described an ordinary colleague, reliable, predictable, someone who talked about future plans without hesitation. Family members spoke of phone calls that ended normally, voices calm, nothing that suggested fear or urgency. Each account reinforced the same conclusion, that this disappearance did not grow out of chaos, but out of something planned or opportunistic, something that exploited trust rather than shattered it. The neighborhood became its own kind of evidence. Officers walked the street again and again, tracing sightlines, noting which houses had clear views of the victim's front door and which were blind behind hedges and fences. They learned who stayed up late, who left early, who worked nights and who rarely slept at all. One neighbor remembered a car parked unusually close to the curb that night, engine running longer than necessary, headlights off. Another recalled hearing voices, low and indistinct, but could not say how late it was or what was said. These details hovered just below the threshold of usefulness, frustratingly vague, impossible to anchor to a specific moment. As tips trickled in, the case began to fragment into competing theories. One suggested an impulsive crime, a confrontation that spiraled quickly and ended somewhere far from the house. Another leaned toward a calculated act, someone who had waited for the right conditions, who understood the victim's habits and exploited them. A third whispered about voluntary disappearance, about secrets and second lives, but that theory struggled to survive contact with the facts, with the untouched wallet, the abandoned keys, the absence of any financial movement afterward. This did not look like someone choosing to vanish, it looked like someone being removed. The Florida landscape offered both hope and dread. Canals wound through the area like veins, dark and slow-moving, bordered by thick vegetation that swallowed sound. Woods stretched beyond the last houses, dense and unforgiving, places where a search could miss something 10 feet away. Boats were checked, divers deployed, dogs brought in to follow scents that faded into nothing. Each operation ended the same way, with reports filed and shoulders slumped, the silence returning as if to mock the effort. The environment seemed complicit, its vastness protecting whatever secret it held. Inside the department, pressure mounted quietly. Media calls came daily, then hourly, reporters hungry for developments, for angles, for reassurance that progress was being made. Detectives learned to speak carefully, to offer updates without promising answers. They felt the weight of expectation not just from the public, but from themselves, the unspoken understanding that cases like this have a shelf life, that attention fades and resources shift, leaving behind only the most stubborn investigators and the most stubborn questions. Every decision carried the fear of missing the one detail that mattered. One lead briefly electrified the case, a report of a similar disappearance in a nearby county, same year, similar circumstances, a home left intact, no signs of struggle. 4 days, teams compared notes, shared files, searched for overlaps in social circles, travel patterns, vehicles. The similarities were unsettling, suggesting the possibility of a pattern, but the differences were just as strong, and eventually the connection dissolved under scrutiny. Still, the idea lingered, a reminder that this might not be an isolated event, that something broader could be moving just out of view. The victim's house remained frozen in time, evidence tags hanging from objects that had become symbols rather than clues. Investigators stood in the doorway and tried to imagine the moment of departure, the choice to step outside, the sound of the door closing or not closing, the way the night air would have felt on bare skin. They asked themselves whether the victim sensed danger, whether there was a second of hesitation, a glance back, a thought that something was wrong. These questions had no answers, but they refused to go away, replaying themselves in quiet moments, in the spaces between phone calls and reports. As weeks turned into months, the case file thickened with paper and thinned of hope. Leads slowed, tips dried up, and the investigation shifted into a maintenance phase, less visible, more reliant on analysis than action. Detectives reviewed everything again, this time looking for what they might have dismissed early on, what seemed too small or too strange to matter. They scrutinized phone logs, noting calls that lasted seconds longer than expected, messages that felt slightly out of character. They traced movements through receipts and timestamps, building a digital ghost of a person who no longer existed in the physical world. The community's reaction evolved from shock to vigilance to fatigue. At first, neighbors watched each other closely, shared information, attended meetings, demanded answers. Over time, life resumed its rhythms, not because the mystery was solved, but because people needed normalcy to survive it. Yet the case never fully left. It surfaced in conversations, in glances at the empty house, in the way parents tightened their grip on children's hands at dusk. The absence had become part of the landscape, a silent reminder that safety was not guaranteed. Inside the investigation, doubt crept in alongside determination. Detectives questioned their assumptions, argued over theories, challenged each other's interpretations. Was the lack of evidence a sign of extraordinary planning, or of a simple truth they were missing? Was the victim lured away by someone trusted, or forced by someone desperate? Each possibility carried implications that were equally unsettling. Trust implied betrayal, and force implied violence hidden with remarkable efficiency. Neither offered comfort. The phrase cold case began to appear more often, first in internal discussions, then in media coverage, its meaning heavy with resignation. It signaled a shift, not an end, but a recognition that the easy answers were gone. Resources were reassigned, priorities adjusted, and the case moved from the front of the board to a quieter corner, still present, still alive, but no longer commanding immediate attention. For the detectives who had lived with it from the start, this transition felt like a failure, even though they knew it was inevitable. Yet even as the case cooled, it refused to die. New technology promised new possibilities, and the file was preserved with the hope that time might become an ally rather than an enemy. Evidence was stored carefully, notes digitized, timelines preserved. The investigation entered a long sleep, punctuated by occasional dreams of breakthroughs that never quite materialized. Years would pass before the words closed and Florida 2000 would be spoken together with certainty, but the groundwork for that moment was being laid here, in the quiet persistence of detectives who refused to forget a door left ajar and a life that vanished without leaving a mark, a mystery that settled into the bones of everyone who touched it and waited, patient and unresolved, for the future to catch up. Time did what it always does to unsolved cases, it stretched them thin and then pressed them flat, turning urgency into routine, turning panic into procedure, and by the time the first year slipped past the disappearance, the investigation no longer felt like a fire but like an ember, still hot, still dangerous, but easy for the outside world to overlook. Inside the department, the file lived on a shelf that detectives passed every day, its spine worn, its weight familiar, a reminder that some questions do not age out, they just wait. The victim's name was no longer breaking news, But among those assigned to the case, it was spoken with the same careful emphasis, the same frustration, the same quiet promise not to let it disappear completely. Cold case status did not mean inactivity, it meant patience sharpened into something harder, something more deliberate. The evidence was reviewed again, not with the optimism of the early days, but with a colder eye, looking for patterns rather than revelations. Analysts built charts and timelines that spanned months, then years, marking every confirmed movement, every verified call, every moment that could be anchored to fact. The gaps between those anchors became the focus, wide stretches of unknown where anything could have happened and probably did. Those gaps were the case now. Technology crept forward as the years passed, offering tools that hadn't existed when the victim vanished. Old phone records were digitized, reanalyzed for patterns that might have been invisible before. Databases expanded, allowing investigators to cross-reference vehicles, addresses, names, looking for overlaps that could suggest a hidden connection. What once required intuition could now be tested against data, but data, like everything else in this case, refused to point decisively in one direction. It hinted, it suggested, it teased, but it did not confirm. One recurring question refused to let go: why that night, why that moment? The victim's routine had been stable for years, predictable enough to set a clock by. There were no upcoming events that explained a sudden deviation, no known conflicts that escalated toward violence. If this was planned, it was planned quietly, patiently, by someone willing to wait for exactly the right conditions. If it was spontaneous, it was executed with a level of control that bordered on professional. Either way, chance alone felt insufficient as an explanation. Detectives revisited the idea of trust, the uncomfortable possibility that the victim had opened the door willingly. They compiled a list of everyone who could have stood there without raising alarm: friends, acquaintances, service workers, neighbors, anyone who had a plausible reason to knock. Each name was scrutinized, backgrounds checked, alibis reconstructed as best they could be years after the fact. Most of those alibis held, reinforced by records, witnesses, the slow accumulation of time that made lies harder to maintain. A few remained uncertain, not because they were suspicious, but because memory erodes, and certainty becomes a luxury. The neighborhood had changed. New families moved in, old ones moved away, the street no longer looked like the photographs taken in 2000. Trees grew taller, hedges thicker, paint faded and was replaced. The house itself eventually sold, its history disclosed in quiet conversations, its rooms filled again with life that did not belong to the victim. For investigators, returning to the street felt disorienting, like walking onto a stage where the set had been rebuilt for a different play. The absence remained, but it was layered beneath years of normalcy. Every so often, a tip would break the routine, a call sparked by a memory or a rumor or a conscience that had finally decided to speak. These calls arrived late at night, or early in the morning, voices hesitant, details uncertain. Someone thought they saw the victim years ago, alive, somewhere far away. Someone claimed to know who did it, but could not provide specifics. Someone hinted at a secret relationship, a hidden conflict. Each tip was logged, investigated, compared against what was already known. Most collapsed under scrutiny, but each one forced detectives to reopen the file, to feel again the weight of unresolved possibility. The family lived with a different kind of time, one that did not move forward so much as circle endlessly around the same questions. Birthdays passed without celebration, holidays arrived carrying the same empty chair. Hope flared and dimmed with every rumor, every update, every promise of renewed effort. They learned the language of investigations, the difference between leads and evidence, between interest and proof. They learned to measure progress not in answers, but in attention, in the assurance that the case was still alive somewhere, even if it was dormant. Years turned into more years, and the case became a reference point within the department, a story told to new detectives as both caution and motivation. It illustrated how clean a disappearance could be, how little it sometimes took to erase a person from the visible world. It also illustrated persistence, the refusal to close a file simply because it was difficult. The words Florida 2000 carried weight, shorthand for a mystery that had resisted every attempt to simplify it. Advances in forensic science offered another flicker of hope. Items collected from the house were retested, examined with techniques that had not been available at the time. Trace evidence was analyzed, profiles built from fragments so small they once seemed meaningless. For a moment, it felt like the case might finally crack, that science would succeed where intuition had failed. The results were frustratingly inconclusive, yielding possibilities rather than certainties, opening doors that led to more doors instead of answers. One theory gained quiet traction within the investigation, never officially endorsed, but never dismissed either. It suggested that the disappearance was not an isolated event, but part of a series too subtle to be recognized at the time. That idea sent detectives back into old files, scanning for cases with similar elements, similar absences, similar silence. They found echoes, but not enough to form a pattern strong enough to name. Still, the echoes lingered, reinforcing the sense that this case existed in a larger, darker context. The emotional toll on those assigned to the file was rarely discussed, but it was real. Unsolved cases have a way of seeping into the cracks of a life, surfacing in quiet moments, in half-remembered dreams. Detectives found themselves thinking about the victim during ordinary activities, wondering what they would be doing now, how old they would be, what their life might have looked like if the door had never opened that night. These thoughts were distractions, but also fuel, reminders that the case was not an abstract puzzle, but a story interrupted. As the second decade approached, the investigation faced a hard truth. Witnesses were aging, memories fading, some people involved had died. Opportunities for fresh information were narrowing, not expanding. Yet paradoxically, time also loosened tongues. Secrets carried for years grow heavy, and the longer a mystery remains unsolved, the more pressure it exerts on those who know something, anything. Detectives held on to that paradox, believing that patience might still be rewarded. The phrase cold case closed remained absent from official records, replaced instead by active pending new information, a bureaucratic compromise that acknowledged reality without surrendering to it. The file was revisited periodically, its contents familiar but never comfortable. Each review ended the same way, with no arrest, no remains, no definitive explanation, only the reaffirmation that the disappearance had been deliberate, significant, and unresolved. In the community, the case faded into local legend, mentioned occasionally, often inaccurately, its details distorted by repetition. Some believed it had been solved quietly, others that the victim had run away, others that the truth was too disturbing to be shared. These narratives filled the vacuum left by official silence, offering closure where none existed. For those who knew better, these stories were another kind of loss, a reminder that without answers, fiction thrives. And still, beneath the layers of time and rumor, the original questions waited, unchanged. Who stood at that door? What was said in the seconds before the victim stepped outside? Where the path led once the streetlights were behind them? The investigation had traveled far from that moment, through years of analysis and doubt, but it always returned there, to the threshold between safety and disappearance. Somewhere beyond that threshold, the truth remained intact, untouched by speculation, patient in its silence, waiting for the moment when the right combination of memory, technology, and chance would finally force it into the light, or leave it buried forever in the long shadow of a Florida night that never truly ended. The fourth year after the disappearance arrived without ceremony, no headlines, no anniversary coverage, just a quiet shift inside the department as the case was reassigned once again, not because it had failed, but because time had claimed another set of hands. New detectives approached the file the way one approaches a sealed room, cautious, curious, aware that whatever mattered most might be hidden in plain sight or buried under assumptions made long before they arrived. They read reports written by people they had never met, felt the weight of decisions made in urgency, and wondered what they would have done differently if they had been there on that first night, standing in the doorway of a house that refused to explain itself. Fresh eyes brought fresh friction. The new team questioned everything, not out of arrogance, but necessity. They challenged timelines that had been treated as fixed, re-examined statements that had been accepted as truth simply because they were repeated often enough. They noticed small inconsistencies, not enough to accuse, but enough to reopen conversations. A neighbor's recollection shifted slightly when revisited years later. A friend's certainty softened into possibility. These changes were not dramatic, but they mattered, because in a case built on absence, even the smallest movement could signal a crack. One detail, long noted but never fully explored, began to loom larger. In the days before the disappearance, the victim had received a series of brief phone calls, none lasting more than a minute, all from numbers that left little trace. At the time, they were dismissed as wrong numbers, telemarketers, background noise in a world still adjusting to mobile phones. Now, with better tools and a deeper sense of unease, those calls felt different, deliberate in their brevity, timed in a way that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Investigators traced what they could, running the numbers through updated databases, uncovering partial links to prepaid phones, accounts that no longer existed, identities that evaporated under scrutiny. The idea of preparation surfaced again, heavier this time. If someone had been testing availability, confirming routines, ensuring the victim would be home and alone, these calls could have been reconnaissance, quiet and efficient. That possibility reframed the disappearance not as a sudden rupture, but as the final act of a process already in motion. It suggested patience, calculation, a willingness to wait for the moment when resistance would be minimal and questions would come too late. Attention shifted back to the victim's social circle, this time with a focus on proximity rather than motive. Who lived close enough to observe without being noticed? Who knew the rhythms of the street, the habits of the house? The list narrowed quickly, not because guilt was implied, but because opportunity is stubbornly geographic. Investigators mapped movements, reconstructing nights and mornings from years past, leaning on records, receipts, fragments of data that survived the erosion of time. Some names faded under scrutiny, others remained stubbornly present, not suspicious enough to charge, but impossible to fully dismiss. One individual, long considered peripheral, began to draw quiet interest. Not a close friend, not a stranger, someone who existed in the margins of the victim's life, familiar enough to avoid alarm, distant enough to escape early suspicion. Their timeline that night was vague, supported by no one but themselves, not contradicted, but not confirmed either. Years earlier, this might have been enough to raise alarms, but now it was simply another uncertainty in a case defined by them. Still, detectives noted the overlap, the coincidences that stacked just a little too neatly to ignore. The investigation pressed carefully, aware that time had changed not just memories, but people. Lives had moved on, circumstances shifted, defenses hardened. Questions were asked gently, framed as clarifications rather than accusations. The responses were calm, practiced, perhaps too practiced, but without evidence, intuition remained just that, a feeling with no legal weight. The line between persistence and harassment was thin, and detectives walked it cautiously, knowing that one misstep could shut doors permanently. Meanwhile, the community's relationship with the case evolved again. A new generation had grown up hearing fragments of the story, a disappearance spoken of in hushed tones, stripped of detail, heavy with implication. For them, it was less a real event than a cautionary tale, a reminder whispered by parents, a name occasionally resurfacing in local forums and late-night conversations. The house was no longer pointed out, but the memory lingered, embedded in the collective consciousness like a scar that had faded but never healed. Inside the department, the case became a proving ground for emerging techniques. Behavioral analysis was applied retroactively, profiles built from what little was known about the crime itself rather than the victim. The absence of violence suggested control. The lack of evidence suggested forethought. The timing suggested familiarity. These elements converged on a portrait of someone who understood risk and managed it carefully, someone who did not act impulsively, someone who expected scrutiny and prepared for it. That portrait was unsettling, because it implied a level of competence that made the silence easier to maintain. Years continued their quiet advance, and with them came moments of renewed urgency triggered by chance. A construction project unearthed remains miles away, briefly igniting hope before forensic testing ruled them out. A confession surfaced from an unrelated offender, dramatic and detailed, only to collapse when facts failed to align. Each false alarm reopened wounds, for investigators and family alike, reminding everyone how close and how distant resolution could feel in the same breath. The family's patience became a form of endurance, their public statements measured, their private grief largely unseen. They attended meetings, responded to calls, submitted to interviews long after the cameras were gone. They understood that anger would not accelerate the process, that pressure without evidence was just noise. Still, the unanswered questions aged them, carved lines into faces, turned hope into something quieter and more fragile. They lived in a state of suspended certainty, unable to mourn, unable to celebrate, anchored to a moment that refused to move. As the 10th year approached, the department conducted a comprehensive review, a ritual both practical and symbolic. Every piece of evidence was laid out, every decision revisited, every assumption challenged. The exercise was exhaustive, sometimes uncomfortable, revealing missteps and missed opportunities that were unavoidable in hindsight. It also reaffirmed something that had been clear from the beginning: the disappearance had not been accidental, and it had not been random. Someone had intervened, decisively and deliberately, and had done so in a way that left almost nothing behind. That conclusion carried consequences. It shifted the emotional center of the case from confusion to confrontation, even without a suspect to confront. It meant the victim had not simply slipped through the cracks of circumstance, but had been taken, erased by intention. That knowledge hardened resolve, even as it deepened frustration. The enemy was no longer uncertainty, but an unknown individual who had succeeded in staying hidden for a decade. In the years that followed, progress came in inches rather than leaps. A record here, a recollection there, small adjustments to the narrative that refined without resolving it. Detectives aged out, retired, carried the case with them into quieter lives. New ones took their place, inheriting not just a file, but a responsibility, the unspoken expectation that they would see what others had missed. The case became institutional memory, a benchmark against which persistence was measured. And through it all, the opening image remained unchanged: a house lit by a television no one watched, a door that did not close, a life interrupted in the most efficient way possible. That image anchored every theory, every analysis, every late-night conversation in the office. It was the beginning and the end of the story they were still trying to tell, a reminder that some crimes announce themselves with violence and noise, while others arrive softly, leaving behind only questions and the slow, grinding certainty that somewhere, someone knew exactly what happened on a Florida night in 2000, and had chosen, with chilling discipline, never to say a word. The case entered its second decade like a bruise that never fully healed, dull on the surface, tender underneath, and inside the department it began to change shape, no longer just an investigation but a test of endurance, of institutional memory, of how long a question could survive without an answer. The file was no longer thick with fresh paper, but it was dense with history, layered with annotations from different eras, each detective leaving behind their handwriting, their theories, their doubts. Reading it felt like listening to a conversation across time, voices overlapping, sometimes agreeing, sometimes contradicting, all circling the same void. By now, the absence had become the most reliable fact. No financial activity. No verified sightings. No remains. The victim had not resurfaced in any system designed to catch the living or the dead. That silence narrowed the possibilities even as it refused to resolve them. It suggested finality without proof, an ending without a body, a crime that existed in implication rather than evidence. For investigators, this was the most dangerous kind of certainty, strong enough to guide assumptions, weak enough to collapse under legal scrutiny. Attention returned again to opportunity, the quiet axis on which the case seemed to turn. Whoever was responsible had needed access, timing, and confidence. They had needed to know the victim would open the door, would step outside, would not call for help. That combination did not belong to many people. It reduced the universe of possibility, but it did not shrink it enough. Each candidate brought complications, alibis that were thin but not broken, connections that were suggestive but not provable. The law demanded clarity, and clarity remained elusive. One investigator began to focus on behavior after the disappearance rather than before it. People change when they are carrying something heavy, even when they think they are hiding it well. He reviewed interviews conducted years apart, looking not for contradictions in fact, but shifts in tone, in emphasis, in what was volunteered and what was withheld. Most people grew less detailed over time, their memories fading naturally. One or two grew sharper, more precise, their recollections oddly rehearsed, as if repetition had polished them rather than worn them down. It was not evidence, but it was uncomfortable. Those individuals were brought back in again, conversations framed as updates, opportunities to clarify. The questions were gentle, indirect, designed to observe rather than accuse. Body language was noted. Pauses were timed. Small reactions were catalogued. The results were frustratingly ambiguous. Nothing rose to the level of suspicion that could survive outside the room. Still, the sense persisted that something was being protected, not necessarily a person, but a version of events that could not withstand closer inspection. Outside the department, the world moved on in louder ways. New crimes captured attention. New scandals dominated headlines. The disappearance slipped further into the background, resurfacing only when anniversaries rolled around or when a slow news day needed a local mystery to fill space. Each time it reappeared, it carried a slightly different shape, details altered by retelling, speculation hardened into assumed fact. Investigators watched this with a mixture of irritation and resignation, knowing that public narratives rarely align cleanly with investigative reality. The family remained a constant, their presence both grounding and painful. They marked time not by years, but by milestones missed, by what IFS that grew more complex as the victim would have aged. They kept the case alive in small ways, checking in, asking questions, reminding everyone that the file represented a person, not just a puzzle. Their hope had become quieter, more guarded, but it had not disappeared. It had simply learned how to survive disappointment. A breakthrough seemed to come from an unexpected direction. Advances in data analysis allowed for broader pattern recognition, linking cases across jurisdictions in ways that had once been impractical. The disappearance was fed into these systems, compared against thousands of others, searching for statistical echoes. The results were unsettling rather than reassuring. While no direct match emerged, the case aligned with a subset of disappearances characterized by minimal evidence, domestic thresholds, and rapid loss of trace. It suggested a method rather than a moment, a way of operating that left little behind. This raised an uncomfortable question: if this was part of a method, had it happened before, and had it happened again? Detectives revisited those echoes, scanning old reports, noting similarities that were easy to overstate and hard to prove. The risk of pattern seeking was real, but so was the risk of ignoring it. Somewhere between those extremes lay the truth, but finding it required a balance that few cases ever demanded so precisely. The house itself, though no longer owned by the victim's family, remained a touchstone. New occupants reported nothing unusual, no strange sounds, no lingering sense of wrongness, and yet the address still carried weight within the department. It was the origin point, the place where certainty ended. Investigators drove past it occasionally, not officially, not on the clock, just to remind themselves that the case was grounded in a real location, a real night, a real decision made by someone who believed they would never be caught. As technology continued to advance, old evidence was re-examined yet again. Microscopic traces once deemed unusable were scrutinized with new tools. Partial profiles were compared against expanding databases. Each test came with a surge of anticipation, each result with the familiar deflation of ambiguity. There were hints of foreign presence, indications that someone else had been there, but nothing strong enough to point to a name, a face, a warrant. The science could whisper, but it could not speak clearly enough to be heard in court. The investigators closest to the case began to talk about it differently. Less about solving it, more about understanding it. They accepted that resolution might not look like an arrest or a confession, but like a reconstruction solid enough to answer the central questions, even if it could not assign blame. This was a hard shift, one that felt dangerously close to surrender, but it was also honest. The case had taught them that certainty was rare and that sometimes the best outcome was clarity without closure. Yet even as expectations adjusted, the case resisted being tamed. Every time it seemed to settle into a known shape, a new detail emerged, a reinterpretation, a reminder that the absence at its core was still active, still capable of generating doubt. It was not a closed loop, it was an open wound. The words Florida 2000 cold case closed still did not belong together, not yet, not honestly. The weight of years began to press harder on those involved. Detectives retired with the case unresolved, carrying it into quieter lives, occasionally checking in, wondering if progress had finally been made. Younger investigators inherited it, bringing fresh skepticism and fewer emotional attachments, but quickly learning that detachment was a luxury this case did not allow. It demanded attention, patience, and a tolerance for frustration that could not be taught. And always, the same image returned, uninvited and persistent. A door opening into warm night air. A step taken without fear. A street that did not notice. That moment remained the hinge on which everything turned, the point of no return that no one had witnessed and no one could reconstruct fully. Somewhere beyond it lay the truth, intact and inaccessible, shielded by time, by silence, by a series of decisions made quickly and well. The investigation continued, not loudly, not confidently, but stubbornly. Files were reopened, names reconsidered, theories tested and discarded. Progress was measured in inches, sometimes in millimeters. It was not enough to satisfy the public, not enough to ease the family's grief, but it was enough to keep the case alive. And as long as it lived, the possibility remained that one day, something would shift, a memory would break, a secret would slip, and the long, disciplined silence surrounding a Florida night in 2000 would finally fracture, revealing what had been hidden so carefully for so long. By the time the investigation crossed its 15th year, the case no longer felt like something that could suddenly explode into clarity. It felt more like a locked room slowly losing oxygen, every new effort measured, deliberate, aware that reckless moves would only stir dust without revealing what lay beneath. Inside the department, the file was officially labeled dormant but never abandoned, a linguistic compromise that allowed it to survive budget meetings and staffing changes. Dormant meant waiting, and waiting had become the case's defining action. The waiting was not passive. It was filled with small, almost invisible motions, periodic reviews, quiet database checks, names run again through systems that had grown more sophisticated with time. Each new tool promised the same thing it always had, a chance to see what had been there all along. Most of the time, that promise went unfulfilled, but investigators kept returning because the alternative, letting the case calcify completely, felt like a betrayal not just of the victim, but of the profession itself. One subtle shift began to reshape how detectives thought about the disappearance. Instead of asking how the victim was taken, they began asking how the offender left. Clean scenes are not accidents, they are exits designed as carefully as entrances. Whoever orchestrated this had not just removed a person, they had removed themselves, slipping back into ordinary life without triggering alarms. That required confidence, familiarity, and an understanding of how investigations work, or at least how they fail. It suggested someone who anticipated questions and arranged things so those questions would collapse under their own weight. This line of thinking redirected attention toward professions and backgrounds rather than individuals alone. People accustomed to routines, to minimizing traces, to blending into environments without attracting notice. It was a dangerous path, one that risked casting suspicion too broadly, but it also explained the discipline evident in the disappearance. Random violence leaves noise. This case had left almost none. The old list of names was revisited yet again, this time filtered through that lens. Who understood procedures? Who was comfortable operating quietly? Who had access without scrutiny? The list shrank and expanded in unpredictable ways, producing candidates that felt plausible and others that felt disturbingly so. Still, plausibility was not proof, and the law was unmoved by feelings, however persistent. One figure from earlier phases of the investigation resurfaced, not because of new evidence, but because of a pattern of behavior that had grown more visible over time. This individual had been cooperative to a fault, always available, always willing to answer questions, always eager to assist. In isolation, that meant nothing. In context, it began to feel strategic. Their story had never changed, not in 15 years, not in a single detail, a consistency that could be read as honesty or as rehearsal perfected through repetition. Detectives debated this internally, careful to separate intuition from accusation. They knew the danger of fixating on a person simply because they were familiar, because they were close to the case from the beginning. Familiarity breeds both insight and bias, and this case had already suffered enough from assumptions. Still, the question lingered: why remain so present in a story everyone else wanted to forget? The family noticed these renewed movements, subtle as they were. Calls came more frequently. Questions resurfaced that had not been asked in years. The tone shifted from general updates to specific clarifications. It reignited hope and fear in equal measure. Hope, because attention meant possibility. Fear, because possibility meant reliving the worst moments again, reopening wounds that had barely scabbed over. They cooperated anyway, because cooperation was the only form of control they had left. Outside, the community's memory of the case had grown hazy, details blurring into folklore. People remembered the disappearance but not the person, the shock but not the specifics. That anonymity was both a shield and a curse. It protected the investigation from public interference, but it also meant fewer spontaneous tips, fewer chance recollections triggered by news coverage. Silence bred more silence. Then, quietly, something shifted. Not a breakthrough, not a confession, but a convergence. A minor detail from the early years, long dismissed as irrelevant, aligned with a newer piece of information uncovered through updated analysis. On their own, neither meant much. Together, they suggested a movement that had not been considered seriously before, a brief window of time when the offender could have acted without observation. It was a narrow window, minutes long, but it existed, and that mattered. The realization sent detectives back into the timeline once more, compressing and expanding it, stress-testing assumptions. They reconstructed the night again, this time with that window highlighted, asking who could have exploited it and how. The answers were not satisfying, but they were clearer. The disappearance no longer felt like a magic trick, but like a sequence of choices made quickly and correctly, a crime that succeeded not because it was extraordinary, but because it was efficient. That efficiency raised another uncomfortable idea, the possibility that the victim's fate had been decided almost immediately, that there was no prolonged struggle, no wandering trail, no second location to find. If true, it explained the absence of evidence, the lack of sightings, the suddenness of the void. It also made the loss feel sharper, because it reduced the unknowns without offering comfort. As the 20th anniversary approached, pressure returned in a familiar form. Media outlets revisited the case, not with urgency, but with nostalgia, packaging it as one of Florida's enduring mysteries. The language softened, the edges dulled by time, but the attention brought new eyes, and with them, new tips. Most were useless. One was not. It came from someone who had lived on the edge of the story, not close enough to matter at first, not distant enough to disappear entirely. Their voice on the phone was steady but tired, the tone of someone who had rehearsed this moment in private many times. They did not claim to know everything. They did not offer names immediately. They spoke instead about a conversation, overheard long ago, dismissed at the time as exaggeration or bravado. A comment about something that would never come back, about a mistake that had been handled. Detectives listened without interruption. They had learned the cost of rushing moments like this. Details were extracted carefully, cross-checked against what was already known. Some matched. Some did not. The caller's account filled one of the gaps in the timeline, not conclusively, but plausibly. It suggested knowledge of the disappearance before it was public, a red flag that could not be ignored. The investigation stirred in response, not dramatically, but decisively. Old names were brought back into focus. Records were re-examined with this new context in mind. The quiet individual, the consistently cooperative one, drifted closer to the center again, not as a suspect in name, but as a point of gravity around which too many coincidences seemed to orbit. Still, nothing broke. No confession followed. No physical evidence surfaced. The law remained unmoved, demanding more than alignment and intuition. The case advanced in understanding but not in resolution, clarity without closure, movement without arrival. For the detectives who had stayed with it, this phase was the most exhausting of all. It required believing that progress could exist without victory, that tightening the narrative mattered even if it never ended with handcuffs. It required living with the possibility that the truth might be known in outline but never proven in detail. And yet, the phrase that once felt premature, almost offensive, began to surface in quiet conversations, not as a declaration, but as a question. What did it mean to close a case like this? Was closure an arrest, a body, a confession? Or was it the moment when uncertainty gave way to understanding, even if justice could not follow? The Florida night remained unchanged in memory, warm, silent, indifferent. The door still opened. The street still failed to notice. Somewhere within that sequence, the truth existed, finite and complete, untouched by speculation. Whether it would ever be fully exposed was uncertain. But the investigation, battered and patient, had carried the case this far, and in doing so, had narrowed the darkness, even if it had not yet extinguished it. The silence no longer felt infinite. It felt constrained, pressured from all sides by time, technology, and the slow erosion of secrets. Something had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, and those closest to the case sensed it. The long wait was not over, but it had changed shape, leaning now toward a conclusion that remained just out of reach, suspended between what could be known and what could be proven, in the long shadow of a Florida disappearance that refused, even now, to fully let go. The tip did not arrive like a confession, it arrived like a fracture, thin and almost invisible at first, but spreading under pressure, changing the way the entire case had to be held. After it was logged, after the call ended and the line went dead, the room stayed quiet longer than usual, the kind of silence that signals a shift rather than an absence. Detectives sat with the implications, replaying the words, the tone, the timing. This was not a stranger calling in a hunch. This was someone who had waited, who had carried knowledge long enough for it to grow heavy. They did not move quickly. Experience had taught them that urgency could kill fragile truths. Instead, they rebuilt the context around the caller, mapping where they had been in 2000, who they knew, what they had access to. The picture that emerged was not dramatic, but it was coherent. The caller had been adjacent to the central figures in the victim's life, close enough to overhear, distant enough to remain unnoticed. That position mattered. It explained how the information could exist without triggering immediate suspicion, how it could remain buried under layers of assumption and time. The conversation described in the tip was vague by design, a memory dulled by years, but one phrase cut through the haze with disturbing clarity, a reference to something being handled, a problem removed in a way that implied permanence rather than resolution. At the time, the caller said, it sounded like bravado, the kind of talk people use to inflate themselves. Only later, when the disappearance became real, did it take on weight. Only later did silence become suspicious. Investigators returned to the early interviews with this new frame in mind, listening not just to what was said, but to how it was said. Confidence stood out. Over-explanation stood out. The absence of curiosity stood out. Most people, when confronted with a mystery that touches their lives, ask questions, express confusion, speculate. A few had not. They had accepted the disappearance with a calm that now felt premature, as if the ending was already known to them. The consistently cooperative individual moved from the margins to the center again, not publicly, not officially, but internally, in the way conversations shifted, in the way their name appeared more often on whiteboards and in notes. Their proximity to the victim, their familiarity with routines, their unchanging account, all of it took on a sharper edge. None of it was illegal. All of it was troubling. A renewed interview was requested, framed as an update, an opportunity to clarify details in light of evolving understanding. The setting was neutral, controlled, stripped of intimidation. The questions were precise but open-ended, designed to invite narrative rather than confrontation. The responses came smoothly, confidently, the same story told the same way it had been for years. That consistency was impressive, almost admirable, and deeply unsettling. When asked about the night of the disappearance, the individual spoke without hesitation, timelines crisp, movements clear. When asked about conversations afterward, about reactions within their circle, the answers grew slightly less precise, not enough to register as deception, but enough to register as selection. Certain topics were passed over quickly. Certain names were avoided. These were not mistakes. They were choices. Investigators noted everything, knowing that none of it would matter in isolation. The law did not care about discomfort. It cared about proof. And proof remained elusive, locked behind the same barrier it always had been. No body, no scene, no direct evidence tying anyone to a crime. Circumstantial cases could be powerful, but only when the circumstances converged tightly enough to leave no alternative. This case still allowed too many. Outside the interview room, debate intensified. Some detectives believed they were closing in on the truth, that the shape of the story was finally visible, even if the details remained blurred. Others warned against tunnel vision, against mistaking coherence for correctness. They argued that the case had always tempted investigators with plausible narratives, each one collapsing eventually under scrutiny. This, they cautioned, could be another mirage. The disagreement was not hostile, but it was charged. Everyone involved understood what was at stake, not just professionally, but ethically. Accusing someone without evidence was not justice, no matter how satisfying it felt. Yet doing nothing, allowing the case to drift back into dormancy, felt equally wrong. The balance between action and restraint had never been more precarious. The family was informed, carefully, that new information had emerged, that the case was active again in a meaningful way. They asked the questions they had learned to ask over years of disappointment. Does this change anything? Does this bring us closer? The answers were honest and unsatisfying. It brings clarity. It does not bring certainty. Hope stirred anyway, fragile and dangerous, but impossible to suppress. As the investigation recalibrated, attention turned to corroboration. Could the caller's account be verified independently? Could the overheard conversation be placed in time and space? Could other witnesses be found who remembered fragments of the same exchange? This work was slow, painstaking, dependent on memories that had aged badly. Some people remembered nothing. Others remembered too much, stories inflated by years of speculation. Sorting signal from noise required patience that bordered on obsession. One secondary witness came forward reluctantly, prompted by renewed media coverage. Their account did not confirm the conversation exactly, but it echoed its tone, the same casual reference to a problem solved, the same implication of finality. The details were inconsistent, but the sentiment aligned. Two independent memories pointing in the same direction did not equal proof, but they were harder to dismiss as coincidence. Investigators began to outline a hypothetical sequence of events, not as an accusation, but as a test. If the victim had been lured outside by someone familiar, during the narrow window identified years earlier, if the interaction had been brief and controlled, if the outcome had been immediate, then the absence of evidence made sense. It explained the lack of disturbance, the silence of the street, the efficiency of the disappearance. It did not explain everything, but it explained enough. The problem was what came next. Where did the victim go? How was the body concealed so completely that decades of searching found nothing? Florida offered too many answers to that question, and none of them could be proven retroactively. Time had erased tracks, altered landscapes, swallowed possibilities. Even if investigators were standing on the truth, it was buried too deep to exhume legally. The phrase closed began to take on a different meaning inside the department. Not closure in the emotional sense, not justice in the legal sense, but closure of inquiry, the point at which further investigation would no longer produce new information. That threshold was approaching, and everyone felt it. The case was no longer expanding. It was contracting, tightening around a core that refused to yield its final secret. A decision loomed, quiet but consequential. Whether to name a suspect officially, knowing the case would likely never see a courtroom. Whether to present findings publicly, offering the community an answer that could not be enforced. Whether to let the case rest with an internal understanding that would never be spoken aloud. Each option carried risk, and none offered satisfaction. The detectives who had lived with the case the longest felt the weight of that choice most acutely. They remembered the early days, the hope, the certainty that answers would come quickly. They remembered the years of silence, the false starts, the slow accumulation of understanding without resolution. To them, the case was not just a file. It was a measure of time itself, of how long truth could survive without recognition. As discussions continued behind closed doors, the public narrative remained unchanged. An unsolved disappearance. A cold case. A mystery that refused to settle. Few knew how close the investigation felt to something like an ending, how narrow the gap had become between ignorance and knowledge. Fewer still understood how that gap could remain uncrossable, no matter how clearly it was seen. The Florida night remained the anchor, the moment everything turned. In memory, it had become almost mythic, a scene replayed so often it felt less like a real event and more like a symbol. A door opening. A step taken. A silence that followed. That silence had stretched across decades, absorbing speculation, grief, and effort, growing heavier with each year. Now, for the first time, it felt pressurized, as if the accumulated weight of unanswered questions was pushing back. Something had to give. Whether it would be a confession, a discovery, or simply an acknowledgement of what could be known and what could not, no one could say. But the case had reached a point of no return, where stasis was no longer an option. The investigation stood on the edge of definition, forced to decide what it meant to finish a story that refused to end cleanly. The truth, or something close enough to it, was no longer abstract. It had shape, motive, sequence. It had a gravity that pulled everything toward it. What remained uncertain was whether that gravity would be allowed to surface publicly, or whether it would remain contained, a quiet conclusion held by a few, while the world continued to call it unsolved. The silence that followed this realization was different from the ones that came before. It was not empty. It was full, crowded with possibility and consequence. And somewhere within it, the long shadow of a Florida disappearance stretched toward an ending that no longer felt distant, only difficult, suspended between revelation and restraint, waiting for the moment when the case would finally be called what it had resisted being for so long. The decision was not announced, it was absorbed, settling into the investigation like a change in weather that everyone felt but no one named out loud. From that moment on, the work shifted from discovery to definition, from asking what happened to deciding how much of it could be said, and how. Detectives understood that the case had crossed an invisible threshold. It no longer belonged entirely to uncertainty. It belonged to judgment. They began assembling the narrative the way one assembles a fragile structure, piece by piece, testing each connection for strength. This was not a charging document. It was not a press release. It was an internal reconstruction, an attempt to tell the story as it most likely occurred, constrained by evidence, informed by probability, stripped of speculation that could not be defended. Every assumption was flagged. Every gap acknowledged. The goal was not perfection, but coherence strong enough to stand without collapsing. The story that emerged was quiet, disturbingly so. It did not involve a chase, or a struggle, or a dramatic confrontation. It involved familiarity, timing, a brief interaction that did not raise alarms. The victim stepping outside because there was no reason not to. The offender controlling the moment because control had been planned in advance. The disappearance succeeding because it did not look like a disappearance at all, just another ordinary night ending the way nights always do, until it didn't. This reconstruction was shared selectively, discussed in closed rooms where language was careful and consequences understood. Some detectives found relief in it, a sense that the chaos had finally been ordered, that the long years of uncertainty had condensed into something intelligible. Others felt a different emotion, sharper, closer to anger. Understanding without accountability felt incomplete, like solving a puzzle and then being told it could never be shown to anyone else. The law hovered over every discussion like a silent judge. Could this story survive cross-examination? Could it withstand the burden of proof required to name someone publicly? The answer, again and again, was no. Too much depended on inference. Too much rested on memory. Too much had been lost to time. The truth, or something close to it, had arrived too late to be enforced. That realization forced the hardest conversations of the entire investigation. What responsibility did the department have to the family, to the community, to the truth itself? Was it better to leave the case officially unresolved, allowing mystery to persist, or to acknowledge what had been learned, even if it could not lead to prosecution? There were no policies to consult, no precedents that fit cleanly. Every option felt like a compromise. The family was brought in, not for a briefing, but for a conversation. The room was small, neutral, chosen deliberately to avoid the weight of formality. Detectives spoke plainly, avoiding jargon, avoiding promises. They explained that the case had reached a point where further investigation was unlikely to change the outcome, that the available evidence pointed in a specific direction, but not one that could be pursued in court. They explained what that meant, and what it did not mean. The reaction was quiet. There was no outburst, no dramatic demand. Years of waiting had tempered expectations, reshaped grief into something controlled and contained. The family asked questions, precise and painful. Are you saying you know what happened? Are you saying you know who did it? Are you saying nothing will happen next? The answers were careful, honest, inadequate. We believe we understand the sequence. We cannot prove it beyond doubt. We cannot proceed legally. Silence followed, heavier than any argument could have been. In that silence, the family confronted a truth they had long suspected but never heard spoken aloud, that justice and truth do not always arrive together, that one can appear without the other, leaving behind a space that nothing quite fills. They did not thank the detectives. They did not accuse them. They nodded, slowly, absorbing the weight of what was being offered and what was being withheld. Outside that room, the case took on its final form. The classification was discussed, revised, debated one last time. Language mattered. Unsolved felt inaccurate. Solved felt dishonest. The compromise was procedural, a term that acknowledged resolution without adjudication, a way of closing the file while admitting its limitations. It was not a headline-friendly phrase. It was not designed for public consumption. It was designed to reflect reality. When the internal status changed, there was no ceremony. The file was updated. Systems were amended. A case that had lived actively for decades entered a different category, not forgotten, but concluded in a way that only those closest to it would fully understand. For some detectives, the moment brought relief. For others, it brought a hollow ache, the sense of having reached the end of a road that did not lead where it was supposed to. The suspect, never named publicly, continued their life unchanged, at least on the surface. There were no arrests, no confrontations, no dramatic reversals. If they carried guilt, it was not visible. If they carried relief, it was indistinguishable from ordinary calm. This was perhaps the most unsettling outcome of all, the idea that someone could move through the world unmarked by an act that had shaped so many other lives. Within the department, opinions differed on whether that silence was deserved. Some believed that knowing, even without acting, was a form of accountability, that truth had value independent of punishment. Others believed that truth without consequence was an insult, a narrative that protected the wrong person at the expense of the right one. These disagreements were never resolved. They simply settled into the background, another layer of complexity in a case defined by it. The community learned only what it was allowed to learn. A brief update. Careful wording. An acknowledgement that the case had been reviewed extensively and that no further investigative steps were planned. The phrase Florida 2000 cold case closed appeared quietly, without fanfare, without explanation detailed enough to satisfy curiosity. For many, it felt anticlimactic. For others, suspicious. How could something so haunting end so quietly? Speculation surged briefly, then faded. Without names, without evidence, without spectacle, there was little to hold public attention. The story slipped back into the background, not as an active mystery, but as a resolved one that refused to explain itself. Some accepted that. Others did not. The absence of answers became, paradoxically, the final answer. For the family, closure arrived in fragments. Knowing the likely truth did not erase grief, but it gave it shape, boundaries. It allowed mourning to move forward, even if justice remained stalled. They carried that knowledge privately, aware that speaking it aloud would change nothing and invite scrutiny they did not want. Their loss became quieter, less suspended, still painful but no longer undefined. The detectives returned to their routines, to new cases, new questions, new nights that demanded attention. Yet the disappearance followed them, embedded in habit and memory. They caught themselves measuring other cases against it, noting how rare such clean silence truly was, how unusual it was for a crime to leave so little behind. It had recalibrated their sense of possibility, taught them caution and humility in equal measure. Years later, new officers would ask about the case, drawn by its reputation, its strange finality. They would hear the outlines, the careful phrasing, the pauses where details were omitted. They would sense that something lay beneath the official story, something known but unspoken. And they would learn, as others had before them, that some truths are held, not declared, preserved in quiet rooms rather than court records. The Florida night itself remained unchanged, fixed in collective memory. Warm air. Still street. A door opening without fear. That image endured because it was simple and complete, requiring no embellishment. It was the last moment before certainty dissolved, the point at which a life intersected with a decision made by someone else. In the end, the case did close, but not with the sound of a gavel or the click of handcuffs. It closed with a shift in understanding, with the acceptance of limits, with the recognition that not every story resolves in a way that satisfies the need for symmetry. Some end quietly, imperfectly, leaving behind a residue of unease that never fully dissipates. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense with what had been learned and what could not be proven, with grief shaped by knowledge and justice constrained by time. The mystery that once dominated headlines receded into history, labeled, categorized, archived. But beneath that label, beneath that archive, the truth remained intact, known to a few, carried forward without resolution, a reminder that even when a cold case is called closed, the echoes of what happened can continue indefinitely, reverberating through memory, through conscience, through the quiet Florida streets that once failed to notice a door opening into the dark. Time did what it always does after an investigation ends. It created distance without delivering relief. The file might have been closed, the status updated, the language finalized, but the case itself refused to stay still. It lingered in margins, in conversations cut short, in the way certain names were never spoken aloud inside the department. Closure on paper did not translate to silence in the mind. For those who had worked it the longest, the absence of daily activity made the case louder, not quieter. When there were leads to chase, questions to ask, reports to write, the weight had direction. Now it spread. It appeared in idle moments, in long drives home, in the space between falling asleep and waking up. The unanswered parts, the things that would never be tested in court, pressed harder without the structure of procedure to contain them. One detective kept a copy of the timeline folded in his desk drawer, long after there was any professional reason to do so. Not because it would change, but because he needed to know it was still there, that the sequence they had fought to understand had not dissolved back into speculation. Another avoided the neighborhood entirely, rerouting his commute to avoid passing streets that had once been canvassed door to door, back when hope still moved forward instead of inward. The suspect, still unnamed, became a kind of ghost presence in the background of the department's collective awareness. Not a target, not an active subject, but a fixed point around which the case quietly orbited. Some officers were certain of their guilt. Others remained uneasy, aware of how certainty can harden into assumption when left unchallenged. Without a courtroom to test the theory, doubt remained a responsible companion. That tension bled into training, into how younger officers were taught to think about cold cases. This case became an example, though never officially cited. A warning about time. About evidence decay. About the danger of waiting for perfect clarity. Instructors spoke in hypotheticals that felt uncomfortably specific, stressing the importance of early action, of documentation, of preserving details that might not matter today but could become everything 20 years later. Outside the department, the world moved on more decisively. New stories replaced old ones. Crimes with clearer villains and sharper endings dominated attention. The Florida 2000 case surfaced occasionally in online forums, in late-night discussions fueled by speculation rather than access. The lack of public detail turned it into a canvas for theories, some thoughtful, others reckless, many wrong. True crime enthusiasts dissected what little information existed, pulling at threads without knowing which ones had already snapped. Names were guessed. Motives invented. Innocent people were occasionally dragged into the orbit of suspicion by coincidence alone. It was a secondary harm the department had anticipated but could not fully prevent. Silence, meant to protect the integrity of the truth, also created space for distortion. The family watched this from a distance, choosing not to engage. They had been given something private, fragile, and they guarded it fiercely. To them, public speculation felt like noise layered over an already unbearable loss. They carried their understanding quietly, letting it inform remembrance rather than debate. Anniversaries became more personal, less public, marked by ritual instead of questions. There were moments when the family considered speaking out, offering clarity, naming what they believed had happened. Each time, they stopped short. What would it accomplish? There would be no trial. No sentence. Only renewed attention, reopened wounds, and a spotlight on a truth that could not defend itself. Silence, again, felt like the least damaging option. Years passed, measured not by progress but by the accumulation of other cases, other losses. New detectives joined the force having heard only fragments of the story, rumors framed as lessons. They sensed the weight around it, the way senior officers spoke more slowly when it came up, choosing words with care. It was clear that this was not just another file. It was a scar. Occasionally, a tip still came in. Someone remembered something. Someone had a feeling. Someone claimed to know the truth. Each was reviewed, logged, assessed with the same professionalism as before, though expectations were lower. Most led nowhere. Some raised familiar questions that had already been answered internally. None shifted the conclusion. The case remained closed, not by stubbornness, but by exhaustion of possibility. What unsettled many was not that justice had failed, but that it had been so narrowly defined. The system had worked as designed, and that design had limits. The law demanded proof of a certain kind, at a certain standard, within a certain window. Outside that framework, truth existed, but without teeth. The case exposed that boundary with uncomfortable clarity. One detective described it years later as standing on the shoreline, watching something sink slowly beneath the surface. You know where it went down. You know roughly where it rests. But the water is too deep, the tools insufficient. You mark the spot and move on, carrying the image of what lies below without the ability to retrieve it. The community itself changed in subtle ways. New residents arrived unaware of what had happened decades earlier. Old houses were renovated, repainted, sold. Streets that once felt heavy with association became just streets again. Memory softened at the edges, losing sharpness but not entirely disappearing. For those who remembered, the case was less a story and more a sensation, a lingering discomfort tied to a place and a time. And yet, even as it faded from public consciousness, the case continued to shape how people thought about safety, about trust, about how easily the ordinary can fracture. Parents told different stories to their children. Neighbors locked doors sooner. Small habits shifted, informed by a crime that no longer had an active presence but had left its imprint all the same. The department archived the physical evidence according to protocol, labeling boxes that would likely never be opened again. Each item represented a moment frozen in time, preserved beyond usefulness, kept not because it would lead anywhere, but because letting go felt wrong. Destruction would have implied finality. Storage allowed for the possibility, however remote, of reconsideration. Late one evening, long after the case had been officially closed, a retired detective revisited his notes. Not to reopen the investigation, but to remind himself that the work had mattered. He traced the path of the inquiry from confusion to understanding, from chaos to a fragile form of clarity. He acknowledged the failure to prosecute without equating it to failure of effort. That distinction mattered. It mattered because it separated what could have been done from what could not. It allowed him to sleep, eventually, with the knowledge that the truth had not been ignored, only constrained. That knowledge did not absolve the outcome, but it contextualized it. The Florida night remained unchanged in memory, but the meaning attached to it evolved. What had once been a symbol of mystery became a symbol of limitation, of the edges of certainty. The cold case label had been removed, replaced with something more ambiguous, more honest in its own way. And still, beneath everything, the question lingered, quiet but persistent. What does it mean for a case to be closed if its consequences are not? The answer shifted depending on who was asked, depending on where they stood in relation to loss, to responsibility, to time. Part 9 ends not with resolution, but with recognition. Recognition that some cases do not end when files are sealed. They end slowly, unevenly, across years and lives, leaving behind not answers, but an understanding of how fragile answers can be when they arrive too late to change what matters most. The story did not end so much as it thinned out, stretching across years like a signal fading rather than cutting off. What remained was not investigation but consequence, the afterimage left when certainty brushes against doubt and neither fully wins. The case no longer demanded attention, but it continued to claim space, quietly asserting itself whenever the subject of unresolved crimes surfaced, whenever someone asked what closure really meant. Within the department, policy evolved. New protocols were introduced, framed around lessons learned, though the case itself was never cited by name. Emphasis was placed on early evidence preservation, on documenting the mundane, on treating every disappearance as potentially final rather than temporarily inconvenient. These changes were forward-looking, but their roots were unmistakable. They grew from the understanding that time is not neutral, that delay reshapes truth as surely as action does. For some officers, this progress felt like restitution. If the case could not be corrected, perhaps it could still instruct. Others felt uneasy, aware that no procedural improvement could fully compensate for a life lost without accountability. The reforms were necessary, but they also underscored the cost at which the knowledge had been acquired. Improvement did not erase regret. The suspect's name surfaced once more in an internal conversation, years after the status change. A new piece of unrelated information had crossed a desk, raising a fleeting question about overlap, about pattern. It was examined carefully, methodically, and dismissed. The exercise was brief but revealing. Even after closure, the gravitational pull of the case remained strong enough to bend attention, to draw scrutiny long after official interest had ended. That moment sparked a quiet debate. Should the suspect ever be informed, confronted with what was believed? Some argued that doing so could provoke an admission, however belated. Others warned it would accomplish nothing except disruption, potentially compromising the fragile ethical balance the department had settled into. Without legal leverage, confrontation risked becoming performance rather than justice. The decision, again, was restraint. Knowledge would remain internal. The truth, such as it was, would stay contained. This choice reflected not cowardice, but a sober assessment of power. To accuse without consequence would be to speak without responsibility. Silence, imperfect as it was, maintained the boundary between belief and proof. Outside official channels, memory continued its slow erosion. The case slipped further into obscurity, referenced less frequently, its details simplified with repetition. Dates blurred. Facts softened into impressions. What had once been specific became symbolic, a shorthand for disappearance rather than a distinct event with its own gravity. And yet, every so often, something would pull it back into focus. A similar case elsewhere. A headline about remains discovered after decades. A family finally receiving answers long delayed. Each instance reignited the question of what might have been different, what small divergence could have altered the outcome. These comparisons were involuntary, reflexive, reminders that closure is often comparative, defined by what others receive rather than what one has. The family felt these moments keenly. Each resolved case was a mixture of relief for strangers and a sharp reminder of their own unresolved reality. They learned to manage the surge of emotion, to let it pass without reopening old wounds. Their grief had matured, no longer raw but deeply ingrained, part of their internal architecture. They marked time differently now. Not by investigative milestones, but by life events that continued despite loss. Birthdays remembered without candles. Holidays adjusted to accommodate absence. The case no longer dominated conversation, but it shaped silence, influencing what was said and what was not. The truth they carried did not demand expression. It simply existed. One family member began writing privately, not to publish, but to organize memory. Pages filled with recollections of who the victim had been before becoming a case file. Habits, humor, small details that never made it into reports. This was a quiet reclamation, an effort to restore dimension to a life flattened by narrative and speculation. The crime had taken much, but it did not get to take everything. That act of remembrance contrasted sharply with the official record, which remained technical, restrained, cautious. Two parallel truths existed side by side. One was procedural, measured, constrained by standards of evidence. The other was human, emotional, unconcerned with proof. Neither invalidated the other. Together, they formed the full shape of what had been lost. Years passed without incident. The case remained closed. But closure, it became clear, was not an event. It was a condition, maintained through continued inaction as much as through decisive steps. It required agreement, conscious or not, to let the story settle where it lay. Then, unexpectedly, a journalist called. Not a tabloid, not a true crime podcast, but a regional reporter researching historical cases. The inquiry was polite, informed, persistent. They had noticed the classification change years earlier and wanted clarification. What did closed mean, exactly, in this context? Was there more the public deserved to know? The department's response was measured, rehearsed. No further details were available. The investigation had concluded. There were no plans for additional releases. The reporter pushed gently, citing public interest, the right to transparency. The answers did not change. Boundaries held. The article that followed was restrained, speculative only at the edges. It did not name suspects. It did not claim resolution. It framed the case as an example of investigative complexity, of how time complicates justice. For a brief moment, attention returned, flickered, then moved on. The surge was manageable, contained. But that moment mattered. It reminded those closest to the case that stories do not stay buried simply because institutions prefer them to. They resurface unpredictably, shaped by who tells them and why. Control is always partial. In the quiet after the article faded, the department revisited its stance internally, reaffirming decisions made years earlier. Nothing had changed materially. No new evidence. No legal pathway. The conclusion remained intact. And yet, the act of reaffirmation itself carried weight. It acknowledged that closure is not static. It must be defended against time, against curiosity, against the human desire for narrative completeness. Each reaffirmation was a choice to hold the line between what was known and what could be said. The Florida night lingered still, unchanged in its details, altered only by interpretation. What had once been a beginning had become a reference point, a fixed coordinate in the collective memory of those who carried it. The case had not ended in justice, but it had not vanished either. It existed now as a boundary case, a reminder of where systems falter and where certainty dissolves into probability. It taught without preaching, haunted without spectacle. And as Part 10 settles, the truth remains what it has always been, present, incomplete, quietly resistant to resolution, waiting not for discovery, but for acceptance.